If you want to start an author brawl, friendly debate, you only need 2 words: story structure. I know, but hear me out. We are all familiar with the idea that different kinds of writing have different structures. For example, an essay has an introduction where the thesis is stated, body paragraphs which outline the supporting arguments, and a conclusion that wraps up the arguments and restates the thesis. A haiku has 17 syllables arranged in 3 lines of 5, 7, and 5 syllables, respectively. An English sonnet has 3 quatrains followed by a rhyming couplet. A play script is divided into acts and scenes which are primarily made up of dialogue. Letters and emails begin with a salutation followed by the body of the message and then a closing and a signature. Lots of kinds of writing have standardized structural forms. These standardized forms help readers know what to expect and where to find the information they're looking for. And when they're well executed, these forms help the reader trust the writer to deliver what was promised. When the writer fails to deliver, readers get confused and frustrated, and the writer loses their trust. Stories are no different. They have an underlying structure that identifies them as stories in the minds of readers. If the structure isn't solid, the audience will find the story unsatisfactory. They might not be able to articulate why it was unsatisfactory or exactly what expectations the narrative failed to meet, but they will notice and they will be bothered by it because the human mind is hardwired to recognize and even to crave story structure. The structure of story rises out of the nature of story. In another video, I defined story as the exploration of a change. Story structure is the underlying framework of story that is inherent in the cause and effect chain of events that makes up a story's core change. Let's dig into that a little deeper. The heart of a story is a change. Something changed. In order for it to be a change, there must have been a beginning state, the way things used to be, and an ending state, the way things are now. But the difference between the two, the change itself, is not the story. The story unfolds when we explore the change, when we find out what had to happen in the middle for the beginning state to become the ending state. Story structure helps us map out that change. But the story structure emerges from the story, and the story emerges from the primary change that the story reveals to the readers. In the writing community, story structure is often expressed through story structure models, such as the 3-act structure, Freytag's pyramid, Blake Snyder's Save the Cat structure, Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, and many more. There can be a lot of discussion within the community about which structure model is best, which can be confusing if you're still new to the craft. It can help to understand that these models are all built upon the undergirding structure that is innate to the nature of story. Let's take a look at how these models grow out of this fundamental story structure. To reiterate for a moment, the foundation of a story is that something changed. The change had a beginning state and an ending state. The beginning is the way things were before the change. The ending is the way things are after the change. And then there's the middle, which is the chain of events that happened in between that caused the beginning state to change into the ending state. Now, if you're paying attention, you might recognize this as the classic 3-act story structure. The beginning is Act 1, sometimes also known as the setup, inciting incident, or crucible, depending on who you talk to. The middle is Act 2, which might be called the confrontation, the setback, or the complication. And the end, Act 3, is often labeled things like the resolution, climax, or conclusion. But this is the same inherent structure as something changed. Now, that middle section, Act 2, can be an awfully big chunk of story to write your way through as an author. It's the entire chain of events that make up the story's core change. So many writers have gotten hopelessly lost in there that you will often hear it referred to by some pretty unflattering nicknames, like the murky middle, the mucky middle, the muddy middle, the muddled middle, and even the monstrous middle. So some writers just kung fu that chonky thing in half, and bam, now you have a 4-act structure. Notice, though, that the underlying structure hasn't really changed. In the 4-act model, Act 1 is usually called something like the setup, but this is still our old friend, the beginning state, that shows the way things were before the core change of the story took place. Act 4, now called the resolution or something similar, is still the ending state under the hood, and it shows the way things are after the change takes place. Remember, the middle incorporates the entire cause and effect chain of events that shows how the change happened. This chain of events begins, quite naturally, at the beginning of the middle, where Act 1 ends and Act 2 begins. This point in the story is often called the first plot turn or the inciting incident, because it's where the real action of the core change gets kicked off. Now, let's look at the middle. In the 4-act structure, Act 2, which is the first half of the middle, is often called the response because it shows the characters responding to whatever event started this central chain of events. Act 3 is often called the attack because during this phase of the story, the characters shift from reacting to being more proactive, and they push the core change of the story to its ultimate completion. That act of completion, which happens at the end of Act 3, just before the beginning of Act 4, is often called the second plot turn. And then we wrap things up with Act 4, which we've already talked about. There's a good discussion of a 4-act structure in the book Story Engineering by Larry Brooks, if you'd like to learn more. 5-act structure, a famous example of which is Freytag's pyramid, is very much like 4-act structure, aside from having different labels applied. The difference is that the split between the response, Freytag's rising action, and the attack, Freytag's falling action, where the flow of the action shifts from reactive to proactive, or sometimes the other way around, is now treated as a story segment in its own right, rather than as just the division between acts. Freytag calls this segment the climax. A 6-step structure, like the one Michael Haig gives us in his book Storytelling Made Easy, also contains the elements of the 4-act structure. However, the 6-step structure does not include the tipping point in the middle as a separate story segment, like the 5-act structure does. Instead, Haig focuses on 2 different change points, the ones at the beginning and the end of the central cause and effect chain, the first plot turn and the second plot turn. He calls the first one, where the change begins, the crisis, and the last one, where the change ends, the climax. As a side note, don't get confused by the use of the term climax for different segments of the story structure in the 5-act and 6-step structures. The underlying function of each part of the fundamental story structure is the same, regardless of the different labels people use for the parts. This is not a matter of the climax of the story being placed in different parts of the story structure. It's just 2 different people using the same word to refer to 2 different things. The 7-phase structure model is my favorite and the one I use most often. Like the 5-act and 6-step models, it incorporates all of the parts of the 4-act model. Like the 5-act model, it includes the tipping point in the middle, where the action shifts, as a distinct phase of the story. And like the 6-step model, the change points at the beginning and end of the central cause and effect chain are also included as distinct story phases. The labels I've included here are the names I'm currently using for the phases of this structure model. These divisions help make planning and executing a story much easier for writers, so we don't get stuck in that mucky, muddy, murky, muddled, monstrous middle. But remember, all of these structural segments grow out of the 3-act structure model and easily map back onto it because the underlying structure of story is the same, no matter which model you are using to make it more manageable to write. The opening phase correlates with Act 1, which shows the story's beginning state before the core change of the story takes place. The transition phase is where a story event initiates the core change of the story and makes it impossible for the beginning state to continue as it has been. This shifts or transitions the story from the stagnation of the beginning state and into the dynamic movement of the story. The struggle phase is the first half of Act 2, where characters in the story reactively respond to and struggle with the chain of cause and effect challenges and catastrophes that were triggered by the events of the transition phase. Tension rises and stakes increase until the story reaches a tipping point at the story's midpoint, halfway through Act 2. Here, an event, revelation, or decision alters the course of the story and sends it hurtling toward the ultimate conclusion of the core change. This is where the final confrontation becomes inevitable, even if its outcome does not. In the combat phase, the characters push onward, determinedly fighting through the continuing chain of interlinked cause and effect events and reactions that topples the dominoes set up in the first half of the story and leads to the final do-or-die moment of the core change. That do-or-die moment is a final confrontation in which the story's core change is permanently finalized for good or for ill. This, of course, happens in the confrontation phase at the end of Act 2. Following this decisive confrontation, the resolution phase, which correlates with Act 3, reveals the outcome of the core change that has taken place over the course of the story and the new equilibrium that has been achieved. And then the story is over, because the beginning state has become the ending state. Something changed. But wait, what about structure models that have more than 7 steps? Here's the secret. All of the steps in those structure models are parts of this same underlying story structure and can be mapped onto the 7-phase model. Let's look at the 2 more complex models that I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Save the Cat and the Hero's Journey. For the sake of brevity, I'm just going to zip through these very quickly here. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see more in-depth videos on various structure models. First, let's look at Save the Cat. We're going to map it to the 7-phase structure, but I'm also going to put a 3-act structure up here since it's referenced in the names of Snyder's story beats, and it's all the same structure anyway. When I'm analyzing a story structure model, I like to find the starting state, ending state, and midpoint first. In Save the Cat, the midpoint is pretty obvious since Snyder calls it midpoint, and it serves the right function. Snyder's final image story beat is the part that shows the story's aftermath. His starting state beat is called the setup and includes 2 additional sub-beats that take place during the setup called opening image and theme stated. We know all 3 of these belong in the opening phase of the story because A, Snyder says so, and B, they all take place before the action moves into the transition phase of the story. They prepare the audience for the change, but the change has not yet begun happening. Snyder's transition phase is also broken into 3 beats. First, a catalyst kicks the story into motion. Then the character debates about whether to engage in the story's action. Finally, the character moves, voluntarily or otherwise, into the next phase of the story and into Act 2 of the three-act structure. We then find the struggle phase of the story revving up nicely with Snyder's B-story beat, in which he introduces a strong subplot, and his fun and games beat, which gets down to the business of delivering on the promise of the premise. After the midpoint, during the combat phase of the story, we have the bad guys close in beat, followed by the all is lost beat, the dark night of the soul beat, and the break into three, meaning Act 3 of the three-act structure. And the only save the cat beat we haven't placed yet is the finale, which corresponds nicely with the confrontation beat of the 7-phase structure model. So that's how Save the Cat lines up with the fundamental underlying structure of story. Now let's break down Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. For the purposes of this video, we're going to use Christopher Vogel's interpretation of the hero's journey from his book, The Writer's Journey, Mythic Structure for Writers. But other versions map to the fundamental story structure just as well. Again, let's first identify the beginning state, ending state, and middle tipping point. In this model, the names of the story stages are not quite as transparent, so we have to look more closely at the function of each stage to see where it fits in the underlying story structure. When we do that, here's what we end up with. The ordinary world is clearly our starting state. Not only does it come first, which is a huge clue, but it also shows us the way things are before the story's core change comes along and disrupts everything. And the last stage, the return with the elixir, is where we see how the things the hero gained on the journey have impacted the hero and their world. So that's obviously the resolution. The midpoint is a little trickier to find, but in this model, all the events of the first half of the story culminate in a situation where the hero must face their greatest fear, usually with at least a hint of death, if not an actual death. And this confrontation results in a false victory or a false defeat that fundamentally alters the hero and his journey moving forward. This is called the supreme ordeal. This tipping point shifts the action of the story in a major way. The hero will never be the same again. So this is our midpoint. The transition phase of this model is a little more straightforward. It begins with the call to adventure, when something disrupts the hero's ordinary world and offers the possibility of change, and it ends when the hero embarks on their journey, whether willingly or otherwise, and crosses the threshold into the main action of the story. In this transition stage, the hero may or may not also refuse the call to adventure and or meet a mentor who will help them on their journey. Both of these stages are also clearly part of the transition phase of the underlying story structure because they happen before the hero crosses the threshold into the world of the adventure. The struggle phase includes a stage called Tests, Allies, and Enemies, which are challenges the hero faces as they approach the figurative or literal inmost cave where the supreme ordeal will take place. After the supreme ordeal, the hero becomes more proactive as they enter the combat phase, which consists of seizing the sword and taking the road back toward the world from which they started. The confrontation phase of this model is called resurrection because the hero engages in a final battle of some sort, where they finally and completely overcome whatever literal or figurative death was faced in the supreme ordeal, and emerge once more into the world of the living from which they originally departed. But of course, even though the hero has arrived back in the ordinary world, the hero is no longer ordinary. The hero has been changed by the journey, and sometimes the world has also changed. Whatever the case, something has changed. So we can see that in these more complex story structure models, what we're getting is recommendations for what kinds of events could happen in each of the 7 story phases. We're not really getting new story phases to play with. And that's important because of the next point I'm going to make. And I want you to pay close attention to this part. One of the advantages to understanding this fundamental underlying story structure is that when you map other story structure models onto it, you can mix and match models. If you're not sure what kind of story events might go into Snyder's catalyst beat, you can refer to the hero's journey model and consider giving your protagonist a mentor figure here. If you're not sure what Vogel is getting at with his seizing the sword story stage, you could look in Snyder's Save the Cat book under the Bad Guys Close In story beat, the All Is Lost story beat, or the Dark Night of the Soul story beat, and find advice that would work in the combat phase of your story. Or you could go all the way back to 4-act structure and check in with Larry Brooks about ways to handle the attack that happens in Act 3. Why? Because all of these models are based on the same underlying fundamental story structure. I know. I hear you. But just give it a try before you call shenanigans on me. Speaking of shenanigans, I know what some of you are thinking. But Amy, won't all this just make my story formulaic and predictable? To which, after I harumph loudly, I will reply, no, dear friend, it will not make your story formulaic. It will make your story functional and recognizable as a story. A narrative is not a story unless it has a story structure, just like a poem is not a haiku without 17 properly arranged syllables, just like it's not an English sonnet without 4 quatrains and a pair. The thing that makes story formulaic and predictable is not using story structure. It's using story structure badly. To be a story must have a story structure. That structure can be quite overt and obvious to the reader, especially if the writer is using it to distract from another story that's developing simultaneously, more subtly, but still in plain sight, below the reader's radar. A skilled writer can also play a game with the reader where the writer merely implies portions of the story instead of writing them out on the page in full. The writer offers just enough clues about what's missing that a reader's innate sense of story structure helps them connect the dots and understand what the writer isn't saying. This happens a lot in short stories. The phases of the story can be presented out of chronological order, allowing the reader to discover the pieces within the narrative and use their innate sense of story structure to reassemble the pieces into the correct order so they gradually come to understand the complete story. If you're really good and your audience trusts you, you might get away with even more mischief as a writer. But you have to really know what you're doing if you're going to attempt that, because you can easily break a story and incur the wrath of your audience if you don't stick the landing with a solidly structured story, no matter how subtle. Yeah, I know. I see you over there still side-eyeing me. Yes, you. You've heard exactly the opposite from other writers and writing instructors. So here are some additional thoughts for you to consider. Story structure, plot structure, and narrative structure are not the same thing. Different people will use these terms in different ways, but when I use them, here's what I mean by them. Story structure is the structure of the core change that constitutes a story. Plot structure is the structure of the events that make up a complete narrative work, which could include the events of multiple interwoven stories that relate to each other. Narrative structure is the order in which the writer relates the events of the story or set of interwoven stories to the audience in a narrative work like a book, movie, TV show, or game. But the narrative structure doesn't have to chronologically follow the story structure. Have you ever seen a TV show that starts out with some kind of catastrophe happening, gets you invested in knowing the outcome, and then pops up a little sign that says 24 hours earlier, followed by a series of scenes that show how the characters landed in the catastrophe in the first place? That's narrative structure at work. These structures are closely related to each other, and if you're telling only one story, and you're narrating the events of that story in the order in which they happened, these three structures can walk in each other's footprints and leave only one trail. But if you're telling a more complex narrative, it helps to keep the differences between these structure types in mind, because the differences give writers a lot of scope for variety and innovation as they craft narrative works of all kinds. But that's getting in much deeper than the fundamentals, so we'll shelve it for now and come back to it in future videos. The thing to remember for now is that story has an underlying structure that emerges from the story's core change. It has a beginning state, an ending state that's different from the beginning state, and a middle that explores the central chain of cause and effect events and reactions that created the change. If you know your story's core change, you can find your story's structure. And if you find your story's structure, you can write that chonky thing. I believe in you. Check out these other videos to learn more about story creation, and don't forget to subscribe so you'll be notified when I post again.